Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for cutting your siesta short to come to this panel. It's always terrifying to have the session after lunch, but luckily for us, the organization gave us an extra hour or so we could have coffee and take a little walk and wake up again. While we wait for the last struggles to come in, we'd like to introduce the next panel, which is on gender and security and the role of the state in achieving the goals, particularly of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 when it comes to security. My name is Daniel de Torres. I'm Deputy Head of Operations 3 at DCAF. My organization co-sponsors this panel, and we have been working for quite a while on the gender and security issue. Now, it has been about 13 years since the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1325. That resolution made official the notion that peace and security cannot be complete and sustainable without the voice and the perspectives of women. Now, we have come a long way since the year 2000. The Security Council has passed 5 additional resolutions fleshing out how 1325 is to be implemented. NATO, the European Union, the OSCE, the African Union, many other regional and international organizations have adopted plans, strategies, and policies to implement the goals of UN Resolution 1325. About 40 countries in the world, almost 40 countries in the world, have enacted national action plans on women, peace, and security. And if these weren't enough, this security forum owes its existence to the leadership and determination of 3 women who are sitting here in the front row: Sonja Stojanović, Sonja Licht, and Maja Bobic, to whom we're all very grateful. Now, for a long time, women could only influence security discussions, security policies through their role in civil society as members and leaders of civil society organizations. No more. Sitting with me on stage, there are 4 women who have made a very strong imprint at the highest level of the security architecture in their country's ministries of defense, in parliament, and in the largest regional security organization in the world. Now, we will have the chance now to hear their stories directly. You have their bios in the little booklet that you received when you register, so I won't go at length, but just as a brief introduction, we have Ambassador Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, who's the Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy of NATO. We have Ms. Tanja Miščević, who is the current EU negotiator for Serbia and the former State Secretary of the Ministry of Defense in Serbia. We have Elisabeth Naucler. Did I do it right? Thank you. Who is a member of the Parliament of Finland. And we have Valerie Evans, who is the head of international relations on defense equipment and support of the Ministry of Defense of the United Kingdom. Now, I'm going to ask them now to tell us a little bit of their stories, but focusing particularly in 2 areas. First, on the evolution of the role of women within security policy-making organizations. How has that role evolved for the last decade or so? And second, to what extent has that increased role helped shift the paradigm of what we understand by security and how we achieve it? Those would be the 2 areas. Later on, we'll have plenty of time, hopefully, for questions from the audience. So, Ambassador, if you'd like to start.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, let me thank the organizers of the forum. From the Public Diplomacy Division from NATO, we're very happy to be co-sponsoring the Belgrade Security Forum. It's my particular pleasure to be here today. And being back in Belgrade, I really feel wonderful here. So I'm looking forward to our discussions on the margins of the forum as well. In order to wake you up a little bit after lunch, to break this siesta atmosphere, Let me start with a bit of a personal story of mine. And I actually have so many of them when it comes to gender issues, and I will not start with my dad, who of course wanted a son being from this region, but I will start with my own son, who's now 10 years old. And when I was Croatia's ambassador to the US, he was 5 when we arrived. And one Saturday morning, we were all sitting together as a family, and my 5-year-old son, looking very pensive, pondering, he says, "Mom, I finally figured out why a woman needs a husband." And you can imagine I was a little bit taken aback and thinking, oh, my own son is going to turn back his back on me. And I go very cautious. I go, "Okay, Luca, why?" He goes, "Well, so that somebody can take care of her kids while she's at work." So that little jewel of child wisdom has been sort of an outlay of my career, because I've been blessed to have the support of my family, of my husband, of the community, but it's been a long and a very hard fight. And I hope that things will change for women all over the world. Looking at this region here and having traveled to places such as Afghanistan, and even sitting in the NAC room, the North Atlantic Council room, up there in Brussels, I have to say that this region where we're sitting right now is not doing bad at all. I mean, we're far from being happy about women's rights, especially violence against women and the participation of women in the political and economic world. But I'm also very proud that when we talk about Resolution 1325, keeping it alive and implementing it in the real sense, in really making a difference, it's usually the Scandinavian countries, Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, and down to Greece, who speak around the NAC table, be it men or women, in order to enforce the gender issues, not just with respect to the implementation of 1325 in our own armed forces and the ANSF, but really to concentrate on the role of women in peace, security, reconciliation, and we've seen it here the hard way, how important it is. And now, just to answer your second question right away, how it helps to promote these issues and why it's important before I go into what NATO has done. I just want to quote a few wonderful people who have posed the question. If you think with half of your brain, if you use half of your energy, if you use half your imagination, you can only come up with half solutions, with half of the answers, with half of the success. And I think that is the gist of why women need to be involved in any society, and why we, not just as women, but men, citizens of the world, our officials have to go well beyond our official duties in order to promote gender equality, the rights of women, the rights of children, and primarily the right of education, the right of choice, and the right to make it if they want to do so. Now, going back to NATO, we have made progress. Of course, we cannot be happy, but we have a group of talented women and men who are working day in, day out in order to promote these issues and to promote women's role not just at the headquarters, but in our operations and in everything that we do. So back in 2002, the North Atlantic Council, the NAC, tasked the IS to come up with a program to improve gender balance and diversity. Well, ever since, we really haven't come that far. We've increased the number of women at the International Secretariat from 34 to 37% from 2002 to 2012. And today we have 22% of women in senior leadership positions, which is actually much better than back in 2002. So I think that we've made a bit more progress in the senior leadership than we did on the lower levels. Last year, we had, I think, a landmark appointment of a very talented Norwegian diplomat, Marie Skåre, as the Secretary General's personal envoy for the implementation of Resolution 1325 and the related UN Security Council resolutions. She also goes well beyond that and talks a lot about protection of women in conflict, but also the role of women in peace and security and reconciliation. She's doing a great job. And I thank everyone for the support, and you yourself as well, for the support that everyone has extended to her. Apart from myself as the first and only Assistant Secretary General, female Assistant Secretary General now at NATO, we have the spokesperson, Oana Lungescu, one of the Deputy Assistant Secretary Generals, Francesca Tarrioli, and Croatia, my own country, I'm very proud to say so, is sending the first flag officer to ISAF headquarters in Kabul to be a gender advisor, not just to take care of the gender issues within ISAF and within the ANSF, but really to fight for women's issues in Afghanistan. And I hope that she will be given the freedom and the opportunity to bring men and women together, because in that country, it's of utmost importance to bring the men who are the ones who are still making legislation, to be there, to work with them, to continue to implement the rights and the achievements so far, but also to continue to foster the role of women in peace, stability, and security. Now, as I've said, I often visit Afghanistan. And I talk to women there, I talk to men, and then I talk to audiences around the world. And I often hear the question, why should we interfere with their culture and with their religious beliefs? And that offends me horribly as a human being, because no culture and no religion, in my opinion, can feel that one human being can be inferior to another. It's an issue of universal human rights, and it's an issue of inclusion, involvement, engagement, and coming back to the statement, to the quote that I gave, including the whole society, 100% of your talent, of your brain, of your physical strength into resolving whatever is ahead of you. So when we look at Afghanistan today, they're not doing all that bad when it comes to numbers. I mean, out of the 8 million children that we have in school nowadays, in comparison to almost zero about 12 years back, about 34% of them are girls. In the parliament, we have actually the percentage of women is even greater than in some of our own societies. So we have 28 senators out of the 102 senators in the Afghan upper house. We have 69 of the 249 members of the Afghan lower house. There's 1,457 female personnel within the police, 30 in Afghan Air Force. Out of 200,000 teachers, more than 30% are female. However, when you go out there, you not only see that the female pilots are mostly not given a chance to fly the aircraft, but what saddens me most is when I drive through the streets of Kabul, you have these women clad in burqa sitting in the dirt begging for money because they have no other opportunities. And also, when I read stories, when I talk to kids around the world and they ask me, what is NATO doing in Afghanistan? What is the international community doing there? Why are we interfering? Why do we have militaries at all? And then when I tell them, you take it for granted that today you can go to school and tomorrow you can choose whether you're going to go to school or not. But there are girls who go to school and they throw acid in their face just because they want to get an education. So there are so many things out there, and I don't want to go on discussing that because I think we're all more or less aware of that. I just would like to say that NATO is we're really pushing for a more increased role in prevention, in armed conflict, protecting women, prevention of that disproportionate effect on women and children, in protecting them and increasing the participation of women, not just in NATO, but really in the reconciliation process. And just, to close with a few recommendations, and I will continue with the discussion, but I think that the way forward ahead of us is first and foremost to change that mentality, that those are cultural issues or issues of religion. No, those are universal rights. That's our obligation to do that, and that inclusion is the key to success to any society. Then we have to build awareness and the political will to proceed forward. We have to build infrastructure for women and men who want to be parents to be able to do what I did, to continue working with my 2 small children. But for me, it would not have been possible had I not had the support of the family and the friends. So we need to build that infrastructure. What I think is immensely important is building ambition among women, because with a lot of them, I see that complacency saying, you know, I'm not going to make it anyways, no matter how I tried. Yes, they will. Yes, you can. So encouraging that ambition is immensely important. Fostering self-confidence in that respect, and then enabling for continued education and keep talking about this, and not just talking, but really keep doing things, every single one of us, whatever we can do, from mentoring to fighting to change legislation, to fighting to keep 1325 going, and having a lot more resolutions that will provide for an equal position of women all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think if anybody was at the risk of falling asleep, I think they've been definitely roused by your intervention. A lot of takeaway points, which we'll have the chance to discuss and expand on later. I think if I were to highlight a few issues, and I see that we're being broadcast by Twitter, so if you can provide sound bites in 140 characters or less, I think the organizers will really appreciate it. But I think very important is the point that you've made, that women's issues are not issues for women only. That men and women are actively promoting this type of agenda, because ultimately it's about creating a more just and peaceful society in general. And especially the fact that there's no cultural or religious justification for oppression. Culture is culture, religion is religion, but oppression cannot be justified on any of those grounds. So thank you very much for the intervention. Elisabeth, as member of parliament, your role is to oversee, supervise, and make sure that the executive actually comes through in the promises that they make, particularly in these issues of security. What can you tell us about your experience?
Of my experience, first of all, I'd like to say that I'm very glad that I made it here. I've been invited before, but this is the first time. And I'm extremely honored to sit in the same panel as the first Assistant Secretary General at NATO, and as the first in charge of the negotiations with the European Union. And I'm sure you're also the first of something, because we're all the first. Or maybe the first in our family or something. And I'm the first woman from my constituency in Finland, and I'm the first person who's moved to Finland and applied for a Finnish citizenship and become a member of the Finnish Parliament. So I'm an immigrant, so I can speak much more proudly of Finland, I think, than if I had been born there, because then it would have sounded like I was exaggerating. But Finland has a record. There are many the first in Finland, because Finland was the first country in the world where women had full political rights, not only the right to vote, but also the right to stand in the election. And this was at the beginning of the state. The women were state builders. This was in 1917. And there were 19 out of 200 women in the Finnish parliament, the first Finnish parliament. And we never had quotas. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong with quotas, because quotas is needed in other places of the world. I'm not saying that others should wait 90 years, but we did not wait 90 years. We had 19 MPs in the first, women in the first parliament. And we've gone through all this with we had the first Minister of Defense in the world, first country in the world where women were in majority in the government. The first Assistant Secretary General in the UN system, also the founder of UNIFEM, etc., etc. I could go on with many first. Of course, this has made a difference. All high positions in the country, President of the Republic, Speaker of the Parliament, all the important ministers, every single position has at one or the other point been held by women. And you told the story, children's story, or the story of your son, and I could add a story from Finland with a sister and a brother who were discussing what they would do when they grew up, and the boy said, "I'd like to be a policeman," and the girl said, "I'd like to be the president," and then the boy said, "Well, you know, I can't because I'm a boy." This was during the time of Tarja Halonen, of course, as president. But I really think it's not only, of course this is a joke, but I think it has mentally meant something. It has shaped our society. And the reason why the Finnish women have been so outstanding is, of course, that they were there to build the state. The state was built by the two parties, and this was a transitional period. And it was also, there was a civil war in Finland, and of course the war that Finland has been through, not only the civil war, but also the First and the Second World War, of course that has meant that the women had to take the responsibility in a different way than in other countries. And I'm sure that this has shaped our society. And I don't think that there could be any real inclusiveness if you don't have both parties. And this has definitely also, to come back to your question, how this has influenced the parliament. Of course it has influenced the parliament, and of course we're all the time looking after the government for all aspects. And we have, I don't remember if we're 85 or 86, we lost one female member of the parliament the other day when Astrid Thors was appointed the High Commission National Minorities in the OSCE. She was replaced by a man. But we have many women, and these has changed the paradigm. We do have, I would like to argue, built the infrastructure for being a man or a woman in the parliament, in the government, everywhere. And we have had a prime minister who has had paternity leave, etc. So I think that it has definitely influenced. All these figures are not just figures, it's not only the first, but it has changed the paradigm. But we have a long way to go. There's no doubt about it. We still have many posts that are important, presidents of commissions that are held by men. The Grand Committee, the European Affairs Committee, that is a woman. Women has to move from victim and from the need of protection to leadership. And this is what I think we have done in our National Action Plan on 1325. The first one was from covering the year from 2008 until 2011, and the second now from 2011 to 16. And I think in these recent years there is a shift. It is clear that also in the previous plan the idea was that the figures of negotiators and military people, etc., women should increase the figure of women, and it has done. But it was still a little bit oriented towards the protection of women and victims. And there is a need, no doubt, for the protection of women, as we just heard, in war-torn areas, war-stricken areas. But we also have to move forward to leadership and to activities. Elisabeth, who was the first Minister of Defense, female Minister of Defense, not only in Finland, but in the world, she was also the Minister of Gender Issues. When she presented herself as the Minister of Defense, she was looked upon differently, and she was heard differently from when she presented herself as the Minister of Gender Issues. And I think this is something that we have to come back to, and we have to engage on. I think that's an ideal combination to be the Minister of Gender and the Minister of Defense. We have to engage on both these issues, and we have to work on having women more interested in the non-traditional issues also. We have, as I've been telling about the figures in the Finnish Parliament, we also have a women's caucus, and this women's caucus has been used also in an international arena as a forerunner, and I have been involved in a women's empowerment project in the Serb Parliament. Because of my background, I've been the coordinator for this in our parliament. And this has been very rewarding. It has given me a lot because this is a question of give and take. We very often think in Scandinavia, in the Nordic countries, that we know how things should be done and that we should teach others. But I think that is very wrong, and I think that we have as much to learn from other countries. We have different systems, and nothing could be copied. We're not a model, we're just an example. I think that, for example, just to mention an example, in Serbia there is only one constituency, so you don't know really who is your voter. In Finland we have a lot of constituency, and we have personal votes, we're personal candidates, and that means that everyone in Finland knows who you voted on, and you have to report back to the voters all the time. There has to be an interaction with the voters. There is a check all the time, and you have to deliver. Otherwise, you will not be re-elected, if that is the most important thing. But I think it is this work is very, very important, and this is one of the things that I think that we can stand as an example. But there are many things in this part of the world that we need to know more about also. Of course, the work of the Parliament and the legislation. The legislative power of the Parliament is the most important, but also not only to legislate, but also to put in place monitoring mechanisms, reporting, the possibility to check the system is important. And as I said, in Finland, all politicians, all members of Parliament are known. Because of our election system, we do not have the system like they have in, for example, in Sweden, with lists where the party is deciding who's going to be on the list. And because of that, I think that we can also, we are listened to, and we can pass the message through easier, and therefore it's very important how we act and how we interact. And I think that we can be examples. And we have the responsibility to be examples. So maybe I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting perspective. Obviously, as you mentioned, your country has been a pioneer in many of these issues. First, in many, I think it's important to understand also the role of early political empowerment of women, how through the political empowerment, a lot of the other steps can happen. In the case of your country, it's over 100 years of active participation of women in the political arena, and still there's a long way to go. I think that's also a sobering thought. But those are the takeaways that I would take. Also, the need for active leadership of women. I think At least in the world of women's rights and women, peace and security, we're trying to move beyond the idea of women as victims deserving of protection. It's been less and less often that I read or hear about women, children, and other vulnerable groups. And we're talking more about active leadership, women as agents of their own destiny. So I think it's a very interesting take. Thank you very much. Tanja Miščević. So in your role now as a negotiator, which is not strictly on security, but I'm sure has many violent occasions, and in your previous role in the Ministry of Defense, could you please tell us on your own personal experience?
Thank you very much. I hope it's not going to be violent, but there are going to be some conflicts. First of all, let me thank you to the organizers. Although I don't feel like a guest here, I feel like at home. From the very beginning, I was involved in the issue. But if you remind yourself the idea of including the issue of the 1325 into this armed forces, Serbian armed forces, and into this forum started like an underground movement. I remember the first panel dedicated to the issue. It had something like 10 people, but now we are at the main stage, if I may call it like this, main panel, which again shows the evolution. It's even faster process than it used to be in Finland or other countries. This is our process of growing up, gaining and building on the experience of other countries. I call it instant values, which means we have to bring them much faster than it used to be in other developing democracy, particularly in Euro-Atlantic as a community. But nevertheless, there are huge changes. My personal experience, well, prior coming into the Ministry of Defense, there are a lot of people which knows me prior to this. That was not my topic. I was not aware of the topic of both security and the role of female women in the issue of security. I dealt with the EU issues, and you know, everything is rosy in the EU agenda regarding the gender equality, equal opportunity. That is the standard that we have to achieve. But I've never thought that there are lieutenant colonels sitting over here which struggle to upgrade the level of understanding of the security issues in Serbia. I'm not speaking gender issues within it, but generally speaking on the capacity of the armed forces, and this is the main topic here. So this is what the Ambassador Grabar-Kitarović actually said. This is the second half of the puzzle. Which means that the capacity which can be provided from the women, female in uniform, is the added value. This is actually, if I dare to say, this is smart defense. This is how you use all the capacity that you have and you don't have abundant. My experience started from learning with Tanja, from Tanja actually, that there are some mechanisms that could help. And I wasn't very instrumental in building, and I'm always saying that. I was the product, actually, of being the first state secretary, so that means deputy minister in the region at that moment, I think. Afterward, there was a minister of defense, which is female in Montenegro, but at the moment, which again was shifted paradigm. If I remember at the very beginning of me entering the Ministry of Defense, they didn't know how to address me because they've never had something like this, a strange body within them. And I finished with the full support coming from the Chief of Defense, with the full understanding of the situation. And I only could help those people dealing with the action plan and the implementation of 1325 in Serbia. Again, The group led in ministry was led by, the group established in ministry was led by a General Forza, and I will never cease to remind us that actually a general, the old school general of the Serbian Armed Forces, was very open-minded in order to help to all of us to introduce this new capacity within the Serbian Armed Forces. But also, I should be honest and say that this is not the only case in the Western Balkans. This is not known that all countries within the Western Balkan region are doing their best in order to implement the resolution, are doing their best to cooperate regionally and to share the experience regionally and together with NATO and some more advanced countries in this region. Why? Because of the 90s, because of the experience of the 90s, which is both, in this case, something which was a game changer for understanding the role and the capacity, of the women. Where are we in Serbia in that respect? Well, the political bodies which are necessary for the creation of the implementation of the action plan that has been changed, and now they are functioning, if I'm not wrong, without the problem, and the implementation goes further. One of the issues which I think it's reminding is the actually gender advisor for the peacekeeping operations, which is one of the things that we can learn using the example of Croatia in that respect. But also sharing the experience that we had in that respect with the other countries of the region and other countries in general. If I'm not wrong, we will have, for the first time in the history of the Serbian Armed Forces, colonel who will participate in the highest military education, which means she is going to be eligible for getting the rank of general afterward. That is a novelty also for us, and this is a good news that it's coming from the Serbian Armed Forces. Can we be satisfied? No, of course. No, of course not. This is the only beginning. We can only help us, as Elisabeth has said, us first in some of the areas. We can help, and we will do our best in terms of empowering female, especially in the security sector, which is necessary. But also there are some instruments established by now. One is the NATO Smart Defense Project, if I'm not wrong, dealing with the empowerment of women in the security sector. And it will be very good if the countries from the region, even being within the Partnership for Peace, could participate in that respect and could help in developing this. But even the presence of the Assistant Secretary General here is very good news and very good in terms of the empowerment. One issue that we are lacking right now is something that exactly Finland has achieved up to now. This is the story of the boy and girl, I cannot be a president because this is a female job, or this is reserved for the females, is actually the issue of the so-called feminizing professions of occupation, which now has the negative connotation in Serbia. So teacher, being a teacher or professor is now feminine job, which means it gains less support and it's less accepted within the society. That is again one of the issues that we really have to fight fiercely against in order to help to all of those to build on their knowledge and experience, and also not to come into the situation and to the position that the honorable profession of the officer, policeman, come into the situation of that kind. I would never love to get something like this. So there are a lot of things that we still have to learn. Well, Of course, this is not the story with my new position, although I have to admit it was, if I'm not wrong, I am the second one among the chief negotiators for all of those negotiations for the EU membership. So also I need some empowerment and understanding in my future job, but nevertheless having in mind that the security is one of the main aspects also within the European integration process of my country, and having in mind that there are a lot of those who are looking me as a role model for doing some things, not only me, but also those strong women sitting in the first and the second row, or all other rows here, that I'm proud of being a friend with them, to move things. Not only in the security sector, but also to move things in terms of creating a much stable, much more democratic, vital and European Serbia. Thank you.
Very much. Very important point, role models. How important it is that little boys and little girls can see the adults around them and understand I can be any of those things. There's nothing in principle that stops me if I work hard to become anything that I want to become. I think that's a crucial issue. Another important point you mentioned is, in thinking of the audience that we have today here, is what a high profile this discussion has gained in the last few years. That's something that I've noticed myself in the time that I've been working on gender and security issues. It used to be smaller groups, smaller audiences. I don't remember how many times I've been the only man in the room, which was kind of nice. Everybody remembered me, but now we can see that we have a much more varied audience. So thank you very much for that intervention. We have another veteran of MOD wars, Valerie Evans. So could you please tell us a little bit from your perspective, coming from the UK, country with a long-established action plan and so on, how it feels from the inside?
Indeed, and I'm delighted to be here. This is my first visit here to Belgrade, and I hope it won't be the last. And Daniel, I hope that you're not feeling too intimidated there, and you're being very brave as being the only man amongst us for women here on the platform. And I must say that many an occasion I have been the only woman in a room flanked with about 100 or so men, and so it's nice for somebody else to sort of see how it feels. But in a nutshell, I feel that being a woman has never held me back one tit or jottle, or one eye, not at all, in terms of my career, and it's never been an issue for me, and that's why it was quite strange, but obviously I'm very pleased to have been invited to come along here and talk about the gender issue and what it's like to be a woman in the Ministry of Defence in Great Britain. And right from the start, when I left university and I decided what my future career was going to be, and I decided I wanted to work as a civil servant in the public sector because it was an ethos that appealed very much to me, actually going into the defence and security environment was not a difficult decision, because I felt that it was very important that I could play a role in making absolutely sure that there was never going to be, ever again, on the European continent, the wars that had happened before me, and I'd seen my parents go through it. So it was for me almost like a vocation to go and do something in the defence and security sector, and I never felt at all that being a woman was going to be a problem in terms of being able to prosecute my career. So if I would say just a little bit about myself, I've had a very varied and a very satisfying and fulfilling career. I've largely worked in the acquisition area, that's procuring defence equipment and supporting defence equipment, but I've also had roles in defence diplomacy. I worked at the embassy in Bonn, and particularly at a very important time, 88 to 93, as the Berlin Wall was coming down, so that was absolutely fascinating, and I was very proud to play a role in that. And I've also worked in a number of policy areas, export policy, as well as in my current role. I've had large teams working under me, multidisciplinary, military and civilians, and I've always found I've had the greatest respect from the people working under me and around me. I've single-handedly been in negotiations and placed multi-billion and million pound contracts, and that's never floored me at all in terms of being confronted with, probably on the other side, mostly male colleague, there, because it's always been the cut and thrust, has always been something which is challenging and exciting for me. And now my role is to play a role in international acquisition policy. I support my National Armaments Director and frequently represent him and deputise for him at international meetings. I deal with bilateral and multilateral negotiations, fostering the relationships right across the board. And I feel that I'm in a position to shape and influence the agenda. My advice is looked for and sought for, and I feel I can play a sort of a very influential and rewarding role, including in strengthening the European defence and technological industrial base in my current role. So I've always seen myself as very proud to perform my role, but never seen myself particularly as a woman doing it. It's always been best person for the job, and having got there on merit, through experience, through knowledge, and having the right, if you like, skills and competencies to do all the jobs that I've had before. But secondly, so first and foremost, doing the job and being proud to do it. But secondly, a role model for others, particularly the young ones coming up. And I get tremendous satisfaction. My teams, it's not deliberate. I have quite a few women working for me at the moment, but that's just the way it's happened in the selection process. And it never ceases to surprise me when they look at you and they actually want to see, well, how did you get there? And I'm thinking, well, it just happened, and I never really thought it was anything special. So it still is amongst the youngsters something that they sort of admire and look up for. And if you like, the biggest accolade is for a young niece I have. When I tell her where I've been, she says, "Oh, you're a cool auntie." And it's, for me, being a cool auntie is actually probably something great, because that must mean that she's sort of proud of what I'm doing, and wants to sort of aspire herself, and sees that actually there's things that she could do, that she could aspire to in the future. So has it been a challenge for me? I've sort of alluded to it a bit as I was going through my history and my career. Yes and no. In the UK, as we've already spoken, it's almost a matter of fact, and it's illegal, if you like, to discriminate. In a number of areas, we had our Equality Act that sort of finally came into force in 2010. But it's not just gender that you can't discriminate against. It's race, it's religion, it's disability, and sexual orientation, a number of areas. So now I think we've gone actually beyond the thinking you've got to sort of look at particularly making sure that women aren't disadvantaged, to actually looking at other areas of society to make absolutely sure that those are not disadvantaged and discriminated against and have equal opportunities going forward. So it's just one of many, if you like, of the areas that we look at in the UK. So where are we in terms of, and I'll give you a few statistics of where we are in terms of the percentages of here it's just gender I'll be talking about, of women in the defence and also in the civilian civil service and also in the armed forces. So the percentage in the armed forces up to taken in March of 2013 was sort of roughly broadly on average around some 10%. It's best in the RAF and it's the army that struggles. And those statistics are gradually increasing, and they will get a lot better as we go forward, because it takes, particularly to get to the officer rank, it takes years before they actually get to those positions. So it will look a lot better in the future. In terms of the civilians, the percentage is 37%. It's less, it's just over 20 in the senior ranks, of which I'm part of, and it's probably the most is in some of the more junior ranks. So I would say that we are not at all complacent in terms of have we done enough, and there's still more to be done, and I'll sort of mention where we are now in terms of trying to look to improve the situation. And I feel that in terms of my personal history, that I've always found that the men, and it was largely in the initial stages, the men that I've worked with have always been extremely supportive, and they're the ones that have really, if you like, been my mentors and champions going forward. And it was and the women, if I may say, actually there's the more of a rivalry and the competitive nature amongst my women colleagues, and they're the ones I might be frightened are going to be stab me in the back when it comes to the next promotion than I would with my male colleagues. So that's an interesting fact of how we behave amongst ourselves. That's probably because we're in the minority still, and we're all trying to sort of ambitious to get there to the top. But I do find that I've never felt at all inhibited or held back at all by any of the men that I've worked with. And what I feel that the female view, if you like, can add the value. And I'm not just trying to say, and I think I'm very much what you were saying there about the feminist types of professions. I'd like to think that that isn't where I think we should be, where we can add the value. It's where we can, I think, more the listening, the being prepared not to compromise is always seen as potentially not a very good word, but actually being able to see things from the other person's perspective somehow more than the male view at times. And the interpersonal and working with others and cooperating and partnering in particularly. And I've done that with industry in very sort of hard-hitting environments, but you getting to a better outcome at the end of the day, something which should be more long-during and stable than something which will serve for today, but actually going forward they'll try and get back at you. Actually better to sort of come to a position which is going to satisfy people for the long term has been something which I think is a female trait more so than the wishing to get, say, something, the victory, and not thinking in the short term and not looking for the longer term, I think, there. So where we are is in the Ministry of Defence at the moment is even just this month, I think our most senior civil servant and our Chief of Defence Staff have actually published another defence, what we call diversity, because it's all of those actions I was talking about, including women, change programme, because we recognise that whilst we've made progress, we haven't made enough progress. That there are still areas, particularly in relation to the gender in defence, there's more that still needs to be done. So even where, as you said, that the UK is pretty advanced, we recognise that there is still more that needs to be done, particularly in the defence and security domain. And they want to look to see whether or not there are still obstacles which prevent women achieving and getting to the areas and across all the areas as much as they ought to be. But we have had, not quite as good as Elisabeth was talking about, but we have had in defence and security sector our first permanent secretary who came in from outside, so we haven't yet had one who's been homegrown, as we call it, that's actually worked the way up the top. But we have had a lady who came in, Ursula Brennan, who came in and from the Justice Department into defence, and very much quickly, as we were talking about there, gained the respect of the service chiefs, who were a bit apprehensive at first and thinking, how can somebody really understand that domain, but actually were very supportive after a time. And we have had not a Secretary of State female, but we have had a minister in the House of Lords, a Baroness, who's actually worked in the Ministry of Defence. So we have had some achievements in that respect. I think that's so. Hope that's been a bit canter through of the history and my personal views. Thank you.
That was very illuminating. I think a key point that you have mentioned is how, if diversity is a key strategic goal to achieve in the defense sector, in the security sector in general, what an important part women are of that diversity as being, half of the population, basically. So I think that's a key issue. I'm mindful of the time. I want to make sure that we have time. I see a lot of eager faces in the audience to ask questions. So I would like to ask you just for 1 or 2 minutes to reflect on the following. We've seen that there's still a lot to be done, but we have a lot of achievements that we can count on, some of which you've presented. To what extent are those achievements sustainable by themselves? If tomorrow there were no special representative for women, peace and security in NATO, no women's caucus in the parliament, no gender advisors in peacekeeping missions and so on, will all these advances disappear in a period of 3-5 years? Or if this is something that has become part of the DNA of the security apparatus? Do you care to take that?
Yes, of course. I think it really depends on the environment. There's always that question of quota. And most of us women are against quota. We think that quota is for cattle. But there are situations where you have to impose a quota. I'll go back to Afghanistan. If you don't put a quota for female parliamentarians and participants in the government, they will not be elected. So you need quota in the beginning in order to create a pool of talented women, individuals. And then we come back to what someone has mentioned. It's not about gender, it's about competence, it's about personality, it's about work ethics and all that. So I think that with continued education, fostering ambition, talking about these issues, we will get there in the sense that women really get the self-confidence that yes, I can do any job that a man can, and that will become taken for granted, that we're looking at individual human beings rather than at men or women. But it will take time, and in some of the societies, in some of the countries, it will happen sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, in others, we will have to keep a very close eye and continue pushing for implementation of the existing rights, but to keep going forward and keep including everyone. And here I don't just mean women, I also mean ethnic communities, minorities, or anybody else who is different from the mainstream framework in any way.
Yes, I think that the answer to the question is yes and no. The answer to the question is yes, it is sustainable when it is already through mainstreaming, it has become part of the society. There has been a discussion in the Finnish parliament whether we should accept the fact or not that all 3 speakers are men. But we have accepted that because all 3 speakers has also been women. We've been through it, and then it's acceptable. But in other, as you're saying, we are all against quotas, but it is unfortunately necessary sometimes with individual actions. If you call them positive discrimination, is not allowed, but affirmative actions. And I think that is needed sometimes. So the answer is yes and no.
Wait, I hope that I'm not going to sound a little bit more optimistic than it's normal, but I think that we reach, especially here in Serbia, the point of no return. Afterward, things can be, of course, that the processes can be slowed down, but no, I cannot expect the reverse back. So going back into the situation that it was prior to the implementation of 3025, of the inclusion of women, empowerment of women, the role in the parliament also, the terms of the numbers. So the process can be slowed down, but not completely stopped. And that's my real feeling, and not only feeling. Let's have an example of the changes back in 2012, yes, last year, within the Serbian government, where the completely new political coalition, took and created the government. In terms of all those issues, we had a pause for several months, of course, which was necessary for the new people to gain the momentum. But afterward, I don't see that they are going back. They are progressing even further. So I really think that I am not too optimistic saying that there is a point of no return and we are on the other side of that point.
I think in the UK the answer must be yes, because it's equal opportunities, it's a legal requirement there. The extent to which we will aspire to achieve the balanced representative of the number of women that are in the population being in defence, I think that will still require a close eye and a close watch and continuous review. But it's an inexorable, and it'll happen, I think. Yeah, continue.
For those reflections, I think we still have 25 minutes or so. I think we should open the floor to, I see one hand there. I just can barely see with these lights, I'm sorry. So we have 1, 2, 3 here on this side. If we can take those 3 questions, please. Right next to you there.
So I go first? Thank you. My name is Angelusha Marina from Pristina Council on Foreign Relations. Coming from a deeply rooted patriarchal society, we have an imposed quota of 30% in the political system. Personally, I don't agree with the quota, but I am well aware why we need it, because we need a women's representation. Now, why I don't agree is because this kind of an imposition from above brings inequalities in the parliament, where we have women lining up behind a strong party leader, and they usually are men. So this is how we end up with inequalities in the parliament, not only on the female side of the parliament, but on the other side as well, just not to be misunderstood. So I struggle with this concept. We do need a quota, but the quota doesn't seem to be the best option, especially where I come from. So, and how to steer the debate is still a puzzle to me. Maybe we should, judging from your experience, maybe we should talk about the 70% quota for a bit, or open the debate on the 70% of the quota. I would be curious to hear. Thanks.
Thank you. We had 2 other people here in the front. Sonia and there.
My name is Svetlana Petrakova. I am from Moscow. My question is, how many women in the UK Parliament supported the military intervention in Syria? And what about the current position of Secretary of State for Defense, Secretary for Defense for this issue and for the next vote in the Parliament? Thank you.
Very interesting issue, which I don't know you'll feel duly informed to answer. But let me take first the next question from Sonia.
Hi, Sonja Stojanović-Gajić, Belgrade Center for Security Policy. We are monitoring, researching implementation of 1325 here in Serbia, and also working with a number of partners from the region and DCAF and everyone here. I have actually a few questions, and one would be for Ms. Miščević. As a woman, she got the toughest job, so I'm sure she can answer also a tough question on, can we promote gender equality in weak institutions where there is no merit-based system of human resources management, and when there are so many other deficiencies that discriminate both men and women? So is it possible at all? The second question would be for whole of the panel. You talked quite a bit about backstabbing by other women and so on, which I think was a bit too much, but anyway, you all called for leadership and empowerment, but you haven't actually given us one example that worked when it comes to leadership and empowerment of women, whether it's formal or informal, but that it's something thought of and not just, you going for a drink with a number of friends and crying on their shoulder. But were the institutions you were working in any time thinking on how to support you to become who you are, or you had to fight on your own completely? And the third question, it seems UK is at the toughest spot, but I really wanted to ask, since you don't have problems with merit-based, and I know UK is the leader of this important campaign to stop the sexual violence in armed conflict. It's Time to Act campaign. I was wondering what kind of mechanisms do you have in the military and in defense to prevent violence committed by your soldiers and your staff and other types of sexual harassment and other negative things which, although I agree that women should not just be protected but also leaders, I think it's especially tough challenge to do in institutions such as military and defense.
Very interesting questions. Sonia, you're allowed to ask 3 questions yourself because you're the organizer. But don't take that as a sign. Before we turn to the panel to address those questions, I would like to point out when we discuss quotas, the BCSP and DCAF organized, I think it was last year, a roundtable precisely on quotas for women in the security sector, and the BCSP put out a really, really good policy brief on the issue, which I'm sure is available in Serbian and in English in your website. So I would very much recommend those of you interested on the issue of quotas to download it and read it. I wonder if we can start maybe on the other side. Now, Valerie, if you want to take some of these questions.
Yeah, indeed. Am I right in thinking one of the questions was how many women supported the military intervention in Syria in the parliament when the vote was taken not to support it? I'm afraid I do not know the answer to that question, and I'm not sure that whether it was a matter of the gender. Most of the debate was trying to be reflective of the positions within the population as a whole. But the answer is I'm afraid to say I don't know whether it's a more women thing. I heard some of the debate, and most of the debate I was hearing was from the men than the women, but I didn't hear the totality of the debate, so I'm afraid I can't answer that particular question. The other question I think was, did the institution support me, or was it more that I had to fight for myself? I'm not so sure that it was the institution itself, because I think it's the people within the institution. So I got support hugely from both from men and the women who I worked with to get there, and I always assumed that they did that partly because of who they were, particularly I had some very supportive bosses who've actually got girls, and they somehow could see in me what they'd like to see for their own children. But I mean, the whole policies within the Ministry of Defence have always been open and equality. But I would argue that they probably had been. Indirectly, it had been the institution, but I see it evident through the individuals that I worked with rather than through the institution per se. And finally, I think the question was whether or not, and I'm afraid I'm not sure I can answer that specifically, what mechanisms that we do have within the armed forces to ensure that they don't commit the violence. I'm absolutely sure that there will be, that is something which they shouldn't do, that is, and therefore, if they're committed, they will be, due action will be taken. But I'm afraid it's not something that is particularly within my area of competence. But perhaps I can find out those answers and let Sonia know. Yeah, I'd be happy to do so.
Thank you. Tanja, your reflections.
Thank you very much. Several questions that I would like to share my thoughts, not that I'm going to answer. Starting with the question coming from you on quotas. I think that we are here at the panel that we all think the same. We are not for quotas. But I am explaining my opinion being against quota. I'm not a politician, I'm not somebody who is in the parliament, maybe that's why I have this opinion. But I am thinking from the other side, not positive but also negative connotation for me. So is it just because of the quota, I have to work with somebody who doesn't have a capacity. And the capacity for me is the most important thing. I don't care about the gender if we can provide or if we can or perform the good job. This is my opinion, and this is why I'm strongly against quota, but still understanding the issue of the areas and also some of the aspects, especially in the politics, that are necessary, at least for time being, at least for some time, at least as an interim solution to help in that respect solving the issue of introducing female or the women power into these issues. And speaking about, again, my example, as you asked, I think it was Tanja, asking how they help us actually, did they empowered us in our position. Well, you was here, you saw that there were a lot of support coming both from the civil, that means political, but also military part of the Ministry of Defense. And I'm also now very proud to gain the consensus on my new post, my new job, which I also think is the empowerment. That gives me the huge obligation, but also it gives me the leverage to come back to those empowering me for this position to tell them, okay, now I need your help. You promised that you will be that you are going to help me in that respect. And continuing on this issue, unfortunately, we do have that problem with the weak institutions. But exactly the role of the process of European integration is to empower the institution, or even to build the institution and then to build up the strength of the institution. And then the position of the women, female, in the institution can be built on.
Yes, as you said, we are probably all here, we have the same opinion about quotas. You don't want to have a position just because you're a woman, but men has had to go through that for thousands of years to have a position or a post just because they are men. So maybe we have to struggle with it for a few years. But of course, the goal would be not to have any quotas of any sort, that it would be the most competent. But as I said, I can accept it in a transitional period. And this question about the military involvement in Syria, I understand that that was concerning Britain. We have had no votes on it in Finland, and I wouldn't think it would be a gender issue in Finland either. I think it would be a question whether it should be in accordance with the UN resolutions or this sort of debate, a legal debate, and not having anything to do with the gender issues, rather the political parties. About leadership and empowerment, when you put the question, I had to think about it a little bit and think, what has my situation been like? It's not that easy, but I think that you are very, very right what you're saying, Valerie, that supportive chiefs are extremely important. And that is very often, I think, the beginning. And I've had very supportive chiefs. And I have also had a fantastic network, and a network of mentors that I think I built up myself, and they've been all over the world. I could sometimes make a phone call to Cambodia because I had to speak to someone and hear what he thought about this or that, and these people were men. I have been backstabbed as well, and I wouldn't say in my case that it has been particularly women. I would say it has been equally people who has been trying to stop you. So this is how I would depict my situation if I should try to recall what I've been through, because as I said, we've all been the first. It could be the first from our little school going to another school, or the first from that school going to the university or something like that. Yes, that was the questions.
Build up on that, on backstabbing. I mean, it's so common in politics. Both women and men do it. I think that we tend to remember what women do more than what men do. I always think of what Madeleine Albright has said, that there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women. So I think there's a tendency to remember backstabbing by other women, where we expect their support more than from men or understanding. On the patriarchal societies and quotas and all that, you know, I've given it a lot of thought, and there was a time in my life when I really supported quota because of my personal experience. You know, having been born in a place where you have to, you know, fight against your own dad, who ultimately then respects you immensely, to the community around you, so half of my life has been swimming against the tide, and then you get the support of institutions, of other women and other men, but they mostly look at you as an individual. But I think that our obligation as women is to pay more attention to the fact that there's still much fewer women in politics and in the economy and business, and then really work for that. So there are other stimuli that governments can use. In Croatia, I don't know whether it's still the case, but when I was a parliamentarian, we had the principle that the government, the parties who would get a certain number of parliamentarians in the parliament, you get a certain amount of money for them from the state. So we would pay more for a female parliamentarian who was actually there in the parliament and would not just on the list to fill that quota of a certain number of persons on the list. So I think we should think of these measures that are still that affirmative action oriented, but really look towards the situation where we don't have to think of dividing people as per their ethnic, religious, gender, or any other background. Now, on specific examples from NATO, I mentioned Marie Skåre, who's now the special representative of the UN NATO Secretary General for Women, Peace and Security. She's got his authority to work with these high-level officers, and not all of them are really very gender-friendly. Most of them are, the higher go actually, the more female-friendly they are, as a matter of fact. So she's got that empowerment from the institution to impose measures to protect women from violence, for women to be able to talk to her, because violence in the armed forces is a big problem, and women are afraid to be stigmatized. They're afraid that the case will not go forward, so they're afraid to report it. So there's women like her and people like her, because many of our gender advisors are men as well. Then I mentioned the Croatian Janat, who will go to ISAF as a one-star general officer. Then I'd like to mention a particular case of a woman in Afghanistan, for instance, of how she did it in order to change things in her community. Her name is Roya Mahbub, and about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, we did a NATO channel TV story on her. And when I was in Afghanistan in February, I had a roundtable with women and men to talk to them of how things have improved. And I recognized her, and I said, well, you know, we did a video story on you. And she said, yeah, well, that's changed my life. And I was a little bit afraid that she was going to tell me, well, now I can't even get out of my house because I've got all these threats from the Taliban and the extremists. And she says, yeah, I do receive more threats than I received before. But if I took those threats seriously, I wouldn't be able to do any change. They would win before I even stepped out of the house. But what happened is when you put that video up, I started receiving so many phone calls from people from all over the world giving me a job to work over the internet, over Facebook. I've now been earning so much money, and she's not just keeping it for the family. She's paying it forward, reinvesting it into, she first started buying equipment for other women because the biggest problem, of course, is for women, they can't get out of the house, and economic independence is the key to becoming politically more active as well. So then she realized that in order to multiply that effect, she, instead of buying equipment for individuals, she started setting up classrooms around Herat and having women being escorted by their male relatives to these classrooms to earn money over the internet. So when they bring the money back home, then their family realize, well, you know, her value unfortunately goes up because in such societies like that, sometimes the goat is worth more than a woman. So her economic value goes up, and it becomes a snowball effect of more and more men letting women out of the house, letting them work, letting them make a living, because it simply makes their lives a lot better. But also, there's also a lot of those men whom we have to give credit for. And again, I'd like to, because lately I've been working very closely with the country, just quote one of the very prominent Afghan pioneers as well. And by the way, Roya Mahmoud ended up on the list of Time magazine, the 100 most influential people in the world for the year 2013. So I'm very proud of our own NATO channel TV for helping her boost her cause. But to quote another prominent lady for Afghanistan, behind every successful girl in Afghanistan is a father who realizes that her success is his own success as well.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you. We're going to very quickly take 3 questions from this side around here. So we have Sonia, we have Dragana, and we have somebody there in the back. We can take 4 if you're very, very brief. Sonia.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you. Thank the panel. Once again, this is the 3rd time, the 3rd Belgrade Security Forum. As far as I know, the only big forums that have such a panel. And I wanted to ask you, in all your capacities, and they are quite outstanding, please try your best not to remain, not to live with the same situation. I'm really very upset when I see important meetings where this topic is not on the agenda. And I want to connect this with a question. I would like to ask you all to give us your thoughts. What could be done in order to promote even more the 1325 resolution? Because we know, Daniel mentioned, 13 years, 40 national action plans, out of whom probably half don't work at all. Something more has to be done. And I would, as I said, like to hear your thoughts. We know we are working on this for years and years here in this country. And I must say that we had fallbacks. For example, at one point there was a smaller quota introduced to the military university than it was before. And then we had reactions from different sides. We have the first time a situation that at least our executive felt unpleasant. First time. That after the reconstruction of the government, instead of 5, we had only 2 women who remained in the ministry. So yes, there are some steps, but it seems to me that there is much more need to be done.
Thank you.
Dragana Petrović from FOSDI, and somebody who actually participated in drafting the National Plan for Implementation of 1325. I don't have a question, I would like to comment something. Because I'm quite aware and happy to say that all this is a process and that definitely we are moving forward. But we still deal a lot with the forum. We are impressed by numbers, who was the first, who was the second, who has golden medal, etc., with percentages or positions. And we talk about quantities. Sometimes we hide behind quantities because these are easy indicators. We need to agree that this is the first step to increase and integrate women in the security sector. And then after that to see whether they have support or not, how they cope within the system, how they cope with the professional versus private life, how they can achieve their careers, etc. And I'm happy to see that we are now in a plenary session and that we have more men than last year. But for example, it will be very interesting next year to see General Forza talking about his personal experiences, how he actually understood and worked
in drafting the 1325 National Action Plan. What is, for me, the important next step? Talking about the essence, talking about the change of concept, talking about what actually Ms. Grabar-Kitarović mentioned for Afghanistan. What is the role of women? What are the values that they bring? We've seen a lot of examples of women politicians that didn't do anything for gender equality or to promote women or to support women. So we need to see what is the role of women in the reform of values of this system, and then we can talk about the quality. But that's the hard way, because the indicators are insecure and we have to find out how to measure the results. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, there was, yeah, there in the back. And then I'm afraid we'll have just a chance to take one more because otherwise they're going to kick us out of here.
Yes, thank you. Selena Torlaković from Faculty of Political Sciences here in Belgrade. When we talk about gender equality, we usually talk about women in high positions, and that as some kind of a measure for gender equality in different societies. But I would like to pose another question that is related to women in military, actually. Do you agree, and this is a question for all of the panelists, that there is a different set of values that men and female would suggest in their positions? So if we say that men are more prone to taking a more violent, maybe in military position than women, and female having this ethics of taking care of people and something like that. So this is a feminist approach, and would you say that it actually exists in the society? And secondly, do you believe that women that are in the military would actually promote a different set of values? This is female, this is women in the armed forces that I'm talking about, just to make it as precise as possible. Thank you.
Okay, and we have one person here and another one there, and please, I just ask you to be very brief.
As I'm asked to be brief, I will just put a comment and a question to all of us, including panelists. Gender equality is the issue we are raising here in Serbia and of course in whole Europe for longer than decades. And talking about quota and the role of women and in the political sector, we here in Serbia, former Yugoslavia also, we are talking and working on the gender balance for longer than 13 years, if I'm not wrong. The issue is gender mainstreaming, and related to the question or the comment which young lady from the faculty just put on is what are the values of male and female, and are those values in harmony or disharmony? And talking about the political values of the modern societies of the EU, we working on the issue for decades, myself and my colleagues as well, and some of the colleagues here sitting with us and working with us for a long period of time, we are talking about gender mainstreaming. It is not new, fashionable term which we are discussing. It is the future, if it is possible to say, especially in terms of military issues and issues of the role of the role of the state in security and defense forces. Just to put back the title of this panel, or to remind ourselves on the title of this panel, what is the role of the state? We didn't discuss that in details. The role of the state in transition, like our state is, which is hosting this wonderful forum, is improving and will be improved in the near future, which is go parallel with the process of the EU integration. But crucially, the role of the state, the role of the institutions is weak. And I am just putting the question on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And we'll take our final comment here in the front.
Thank you, and thank you for this great panel. I'm Joanna, and I'm studying the implementation of 1325 in Serbia specifically. And first of all, I have a question for Tanja Miščević, and I wonder if you say that you are skeptical against quotas. I wonder, isn't that the same thing? Because you're skeptical because you're afraid that you would have like colleagues that lack the competence. I wonder, isn't that the same thing as saying that you think that women lack competence? Because otherwise you wouldn't be afraid. And also, another thing that we didn't really discuss is about more the fundamental idea of women's security. And as we can see, we discuss a lot of quotas and also defense and defense policy and military. And it might be controversial, but I wonder, isn't there any other institutions where you can see that women's security maybe is dealt with better than in defense and military sectors? I mean, is really the relationship between feminism and nationalism a happy marriage? I don't think so, but I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Okay, thank you very much. You know, I've already been given a signal that the breakout groups were supposed to start 5 minutes ago. So I would ask our panelists to, as briefly as possible, address some or whatever part of the questions that we got, and just give your final words of wisdom for the audience to take home with them. Starting with Ambassador.
Well, there have been so many questions, and it would take hours to respond to all of them. We've concentrated on the organizations that we work for. We briefly mentioned states. I mentioned that the responsibility of the state is to be a facilitator, provide the institutional framework, but also the logistical framework for women to be able, especially if they want to have both a family and a career, to be able to work. And we mostly talk about women in higher positions because I think that is the problem. When you look at ministries of foreign affairs or any other ministry, you will see that the percentage of women is not that bad, but they're all in the lower positions. You know, we get to a certain level and then we need to keep pushing that glass ceiling. Now we spoke, why we concentrated on security, because we mostly spoke about 1325, which is women, peace and security. And what we can do more, I have to tell you honestly, when I arrived, and Danielle was there, we had a number of events on the implementation of what NATO does to implement 1325. And we had this high-level conference with Club de Madrid, and I realized that we were talking to ourselves and that there were no real achievements. And when I started to reform the division because of the austerity measures and the fact that I wanted to adapt the division, the public diplomacy division, to the new security and information environment, a lot of people told me, you know, well, let's get rid of 1325. There are no deliverables, there's nothing going on. And I said, no way, there's no way that we're going to do it. So I had to find allies, not just within NATO, but outside of NATO as well. And I've been happy, you know, Hillary Clinton was there, Milan Vivir was there, Vesna Pusic from Croatia, a number of other men as well. And we were able to push 1325 in Chicago, declaration of the Chicago Summit as well, and to task NATO to further continue to monitor and implement 1325, to report on it. The result was Mari Skora's appointment, and I hope that many more will follow. What can we do? We also have an PDD, an engagement program on informing what 1325 means and how we can promote it, how we can promote the role. We're all concentrating on gender here, or on women, because right now we are the disadvantaged group. But hopefully we will be talking about the times when honestly we're talking about individuals and individual competences as that kind of framework to really make progress. On values, do women have a different set of values? I've no clue. I mean, I've never really distinguished between men and women in that sense. I know that they do bring a different perspective, that we tend to be more inclusive, that we're better listeners. I mean, just comparing myself to my husband, dad, brother, and others. And when I haven't met that many women in military to be able to make that as a general rule because there are just too few of them. I have to tell you that those that I did meet, and when I went to Afghanistan on 2 occasions, the heads of my close protection detail were women, Croatian women, and they were outstanding officers who were not just pursuing the military career, but they PhD, families. There were leaders in their communities, in their groups, and they were highly respected by men in their circles, in the units that they commanded, but also by Afghans themselves, who tend to have a bit of a different attitude. So I think that having that perspective of having to fight more than men would have to do for the same kind of work and for the same kind of output gives us that perspective that we value what people do, people's work, and that we value inclusion, that we listen, and we always have to make a point. You know, something, just a piece of advice to wrap it all up. You know, beginning with my name that was misspelled here, don't ever, you know, let anyone do. Always correct when it comes to you personally. But also, when you have meetings, you'll see a tendency when a woman speaks up, that sometimes men will try to interrupt them and will try to steal their ideas and put them forward as their own ideas. I've seen that so many times. Please, as leaders, both men and women, go back to that woman who sometimes can feel a little bit intimidated, a little bit ashamed. Give her the proper credit. Give her the platform to speak up. Give her that chance at self-confidence, because that's the only way. If we encourage people, if we give them confidence, that's how we're going to make progress.
Thank you. Now you've made it impossible for me to interrupt anybody in the panel, and we are considerably late. Please, your brief response/statement, or else I will not get dinner tonight.
1325, thank you. 1325, I agree with what you're saying, that there has been, I've also experienced cases when there has been initiatives to stop 1325. If you look at the Finnish National Action Plan, the first one is dedicated to changing in the Finnish structure very much, and quite in the peace building, in the negotiations, in the mediations, etc. The second is broader, taking also the international, also wanting to change on an international level. And I think that the third step must be that we demand things, that we are not only trying to change internally, nationally, but we also have to demand things on the international arena. What you said, Gordana Čomić, on the first, no, maybe it was someone else, sorry. No, it was someone else. About the first and about high positions. Yes, I do agree with you. This is not a question about the first. That is why I also was sort of joking and say, I can say that as a foreigner, I'm admiring all these figures in Finland. But of course, that is not what makes the difference. But it is important still, because these people have been forerunners for changing the system. I do think that there are different set of minds. I don't think there should be, but I think that this is also a transitional period that we're going through, and I think that both mindsets are needed in all different contexts, if it's in a military context or in a civilian context. And when you said, should we combine feminism with nationalism, we talk about our security and we link it to military security here. I have been working as a civilian advisor to a general in a military command, but I do come from a demilitarized and neutralized territory where the men are not doing military service, sometimes seen as free runners in a security perspective. I don't think they are free runners. I don't think that you should put these against each other. Confidence building measures, treaties that we should respect, is also part of the security. It is not only the military security that counts. It is security overall, and I think that the female values are important in both these sectors, and I think it's a question of transitional periods.
Thank you very much.
Very briefly, and I promise. How to promote more the implementation, education. And I'm not speaking about the military education anymore. I'm speaking now about the civil education. We already discussed the issue. There are a lot of gender studies all around Serbia, and none of them are teaching anything dealing with the 1325. I am surprised always when those of my colleagues teaching at the university do not know about, not the resolution, but about the results in Serbia and in the region, which is pity. So education is, as always, very important, a very important element. I really think that I completely agree with Dragana. We should not be impressed by numbers, but from time to time we should remind ourselves that there are some, I'm not going to say historic, but important numbers which were the game changer. And that is important in order to progress. That is, again, my opinion, and I'm sure the General Forza would love to speak in the panel like this on his experience, because he fought the battles in the Ministry of Defense in Serbia. I completely agree. I don't see that there are, to Selena, to my student, that there are different values, or I cannot think of. But not only the different perspectives, but also different approaches, different way of doing things. And that's which I think it's the smart within the issue of female or women in the defense sector. This is the smart part of the defense. To the young colleague from the first row, if I dare to say that I do not believe in the capacity of women, I will undermine my own position. Okay, I'm blonde, but I'm not stupid. I will never do something like this. That means that I would never judge you on the merits of your look, on the merits of the things that you have dressed, or on the merits of the quota that you are belonging to, but the capacity to deliver, the capacity to help me in providing and doing the job. That is why I'm strongly against quota. And the main issue, I finished like this last time when we discussed this in the panel, gender mainstreaming. That's the issue. That's the main point. So let's stop thinking about the separate activities, like the implementation, the only implementation of 1325. But let's start talking about the promotion of the activity in gender mainstreaming. Again, my job now is to involve much more in that issue. And that will be another game changer.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll concentrate on the two of the questions, and I'll look at it from the sort of the UK perspective and try and see if I can sort of extend that to the situation here we have here. And the first question, therefore, is what more needs to be done. And I think I go back, and this is your question, Sonia, sort of more feeling I'm obliged and need to go back and sort of, in terms of in the UK, where the role model that I can be, to try to encourage more to be done there. And if there's any more I can be done to encourage more people to come out here and help you, I certainly will do that. I think education is exactly it. It's having the right culture that values people for what they are and not for the gender or the colour of their skin or their religion or anything else like that. Is absolutely the right thing to do. I don't and never have believed in sort of positive of discrimination, but that isn't to say that there aren't things that you can't do to assist and facilitate and help. And that, in particular in the UK, for example, is to try to make sure, in addition to the education and the training, to make the circumstances and the working conditions amenable and helpful for women in terms of more flexibility, enabling to, and be able to do more home working and those sorts of things, so that you combine the work and the family life. So there are lots of things that you can do, I think, to help it and make things much more better for women to thrive and to succeed. And the second question is I wanted to sort of address is the role of women in the armed forces. And there again, it isn't one so much of values, it's more of the role that they have to perform, because at the end of the day, armed forces are there, and we would say, our chief would say, I'm there to have the battle-winning capabilities in order to do the job. Therefore, you need to have the right person to do that job, and there are certain roles, therefore, in ours where you would say, no, perhaps that's not the right thing for a woman to do, and others where it is. And so the key for me is the leadership qualities, and those leadership qualities are absolutely independent of whether it's a gender of a man or a woman. And for the army, as I understand it, it is more difficult sometimes for women to get to those higher posts because at the moment they're required to have these operational roles, and for some it's not possible, and it's not possible to do it. So I think they need to sort of look at that situation so that women can get to those roles without necessarily having demonstrated that they've been there and done those in a right, a sort of hand-to-hand, if you like, combat role for them. For the RAF, for example, the difficulty of them getting to those higher levels is one more of skill. So it's nothing to do with gender, it's just because we're having difficulties getting women to come in to do some of the engineering jobs, which are the ones which are done by the Royal Air Force. So it's going right back to schools and education to get them to be wanting to do those jobs, which they can then do and flourish, because we've got a very senior lady now in the Royal Air Force that's come through. So there is no sort of there's no way that in that area that they are doing anything to discriminate, if you like. So it's a complex. All I would say, it's complex. It takes time, I think, to get. I think for you to be able to fulfil your vision. But if there's anything that certainly I take away, anything that I can do to help, I certainly feel impassioned to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Closing 20 seconds because we're already late for the side panels. What an honor it has been to sit in this panel with you. Thank you very much. It's been really, really fantastic. Thank you. Thank you also to the audience for your very challenging comments and questions, and thank you particularly for the organizers for making this a plenary panel. I hope it continues on for the next years. Thank you very much.